The cottage in the snow. The cottage stood at the far edge of the village, where the last of the stone walls gave way to open fields and the skeletal remains of an orchard long since abandoned. It was not a grand house, nor particularly inviting. Its windows were narrow, its roof sagged slightly under the weight of years, and its gate creaked in a way that discouraged casual visitors. It belonged to Mrs. Eliza Harrowby. She had lived there alone for nearly 12 years. There was nothing unusual in that, at least not to the villagers of Bramblewick. Widows, like old habits, tended to linger. Mrs. Harrowby had arrived after her husband's death, bringing with her a modest fortune, a reserved manner, and an unmistakable preference for solitude. She was polite when spoken to, charitable when required, but never warm. Over time, the village had accepted her in the way it accepted winter itself, inevitable, somewhat distant, and not to be questioned too closely. On the morning in question, however, it was her absence, not her presence, that drew attention. It began with milk. Mr. Pettigrew, who delivered milk to the outlying cottages twice a week, was not a man prone to curiosity. Years of early mornings had trained him to move efficiently, to leave his bottles neatly arranged, and to continue on his route without unnecessary delay. Yet even he paused when he saw that the previous delivery remained untouched. The bottles sat where he had left them, half buried in fresh snow. He frowned. Mrs. Harrowby was punctual in her habits. She might not welcome conversation, but she did not neglect routine. The milk should have been collected by now. He hesitated only briefly before approaching the cottage door. The path had been cleared at some point, but the recent snowfall had softened its edges, making it difficult to tell when it had last been used. Still, there were no obvious signs of recent movement, no footprints leading away, no disturbance beyond what the wind itself might have caused. He knocked. No answer. He knocked again, louder this time, the sound echoing strangely against the quiet landscape. Still nothing. A faint unease settled over him then. Nothing dramatic. Nothing he could easily explain, but enough to prompt him to try the door. It was locked. That in itself was not unusual, but something about the stillness inside, the complete absence of sound, felt wrong. Mr. Pettigrew stood there for a long moment, his breath visible in the cold air, before making a decision. He turned back toward the village, his boots crunching against the snow with renewed urgency. By midday, a small group had gathered outside the cottage. Dr. Hayward, who had served Bramblewick for over 2 decades, stood near the gate, his expression grave. Beside him was Constable Briggs, a man whose authority rested more on familiarity than force. A few villagers lingered at a distance, their curiosity thinly veiled by concern. "It may be nothing," Dr. Hayward said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "But given her age—" Constable Briggs nodded. Best to be certain. The door was forced open with minimal ceremony. Inside, the cottage was exactly as one might expect. Orderly, quiet, undisturbed. A small fire had burned low in the hearth, its embers now cold. The furniture was arranged with careful precision, each object in its proper place. There were no signs of struggle, no overturned chairs, no broken glass. At first glance it seemed entirely peaceful, too peaceful. They found her in the sitting room. Mrs. Harrowby sat in her armchair near the window, her hands resting neatly in her lap. Her head had tilted slightly to one side, as though she had simply dozed off while watching the snowfall. There was no mark upon her, no indication of pain or alarm. "She's gone," Dr. Hayward said quietly after a brief examination. Constable Briggs shifted uncomfortably. "Natural causes?" The doctor hesitated. "Perhaps," he said. "It would not be unexpected. She was not a young woman." It was on the surface a reasonable conclusion, and yet— "There's something," Dr. Hayward began, then stopped. "Something what?" Briggs pressed. The doctor glanced around the room. It was then that he noticed the teacup. It sat on the small table beside Mrs. Harrowby's chair, filled only halfway, the surface of the liquid undisturbed. A thin film had formed across the top, suggesting it had been left untouched for some time. "Did she always take her tea here?" Briggs asked. "I believe so," said one of the villagers from the doorway. "She was very particular." Dr. Hayward nodded slowly. "Then why," he murmured, almost to himself, "has she not finished it?" It It was a small detail, insignificant perhaps, but it lingered. The discovery spread quickly through Bramblewick, as such things always did. By evening, the general consensus had settled into something comfortable: a quiet death, a lonely woman, an unfortunate but natural end. It was, after all, the simplest explanation. And in a village like Bramblewick, simplicity was often preferred, yet not everyone was satisfied. Miss Marple arrived the following afternoon, her journey delayed slightly by the weather. She'd been invited to stay with an old acquaintance, Mrs. Fenwick, who prided herself on offering hospitality, particularly during the colder months when visitors were scarce. "I do hope you don't mind the inconvenience," Mrs. Fenwick said, as she helped Miss Marple remove her gloves. "Such dreadful timing, this business with Mrs. Harrowby. The whole village is quite unsettled." "My dear Mrs. Fenwick," Miss Marple replied gently, "villages are always unsettled. It is simply that one does not always notice." Mrs. Fenwick blinked at this, uncertain whether it was meant as comfort. "You've heard, of course?" she continued. Only that there has been a death." Yes, quite peaceful, they say, though Dr. Hayward seemed rather distracted when I spoke to him earlier." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened slightly. "Distracted?" she repeated. "Oh, nothing in particular. Just a feeling, you understand." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Yes," she said, "I understand perfectly." She moved toward the window, looking out at the snow-covered village. Everything appeared calm, orderly, exactly as it should be, and yet— "Tell me," she said after a moment, "did Mrs. Harrowby receive many visitors?" Mrs. Fenwick hesitated. "Not many," she admitted, "though there were one or two." "One or two?" Miss Marple echoed softly. "It was always one or two, never none." Her gaze lingered on the distant line of cottages where the world seemed to end in white silence. In her experience, silence was rarely empty. More often it was simply waiting. And somewhere in Bramblewick, beneath the snow and the politeness and the carefully maintained routines, something had already begun to unravel. A village of small observations. Miss Marple had always maintained that villages were rather like carefully tended gardens. At first glance, everything appeared orderly: trim hedges, neat borders, predictable patterns. But look a little closer, and one would always find something out of place. A weed where none should grow. A plant that had been moved, not quite successfully, from another bed. Signs of disturbance that only revealed themselves to those patient enough to notice. Bramblewick, she decided, was no exception. By the following morning the snow had ceased, leaving the village wrapped in a pale, crystalline stillness. The smoke curled lazily from chimneys, and the narrow lanes bore the marks of early risers who'd gone about their routines despite the cold. Life, it seemed, had resumed its usual rhythm. But beneath that rhythm, something had shifted. Mrs. Fenwick proved an eager source of information, though not always a precise one. "It's all very sad, of course," she said over breakfast, pouring tea with unnecessary vigour, though one can't say it's entirely surprising. Mrs. Harrowby was not what one would call robust. "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured. "She kept herself to herself, which is never quite healthy in my opinion. A person needs society, conversation, a sense of belonging." Miss Marple stirred her tea thoughtfully. "Yes," she said, "though one must also consider what sort of society one keeps." Mrs. Fenwick paused, teapot in hand. "I'm not sure I follow." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Merely a general observation." There was a brief silence before Mrs. Fenwick leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice in a manner that suggested something more interesting was about to emerge. "There have been remarks," she said. "Oh? Well, you know how people talk. Nothing definite, of course. But it seems Mrs. Harrowby had not always been so retiring." Miss Marple looked up. "No. Apparently before she came here she lived in Bath. Or was it Cheltenham? Somewhere respectable at any rate. There was some mention of a disagreement. A family matter, I believe." "Family matters are often the most complicated," Miss Marple observed. "Quite. Though no one seems to know the details. She never spoke of it herself." Miss Marple nodded, filing the information away. "And in the village?" she asked. "Did she form any particular attachments?" Mrs. Fenwick hesitated. "Well, there was Mr. Calder." "Mr. Calder? He runs the general store. A widower, like herself. Quite respectable. They were seen together occasionally. Nothing improper, of course, but enough to be noticed. Of course, said Miss Marple. And then there's Miss Evesham. Miss Marple raised an eyebrow slightly. Miss Evesham? The schoolteacher. Youngish, very capable, though perhaps a little intense. She visited Mrs. Harrowby from time to time. Lessons, I think, or reading, something of that sort. Something of that sort, Miss Marple repeated softly. Mrs. Fenwick seemed encouraged. And Dr. Hayward, naturally. He attended her regularly, though he does with everyone. Indeed. And, oh yes, Mrs. Larkins. Mrs. Larkins? The housekeeper who used to go in once a week. She stopped some months ago, though. Said Mrs. Harrowby preferred to manage on her own. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened ever so slightly. Did she give a reason? Oh, something vague. A disagreement over arrangements, I believe. Nothing serious. Miss Marple set down her cup. In my experience, she said gently, disagreements over arrangements are very often serious indeed. Later that morning, Miss Marple expressed a desire to call upon Dr. Hayward. It is always wise, she explained, to hear things from the medical perspective. Mrs. Fenwick agreed readily, and within the hour Miss Marple found herself seated in the doctor's modest but well-kept surgery. Dr. Hayward greeted her with polite surprise. Miss Marple, is it not? I understand you are staying with Mrs. Fenwick? That is correct, she said. I hope you will forgive the intrusion, but I wondered if I might ask you about Mrs. Harrowby. The doctor's expression grew more serious. Of course, though I fear there is little to tell. And yet, Miss Marple said quietly, you seemed uncertain yesterday. Dr. Hayward hesitated. It is not uncertainty exactly, he said at last. Merely an absence of clarity. In what sense? He leaned back slightly, folding his hands. Mrs. Harrowby was in reasonably good health for her age. Nothing remarkable. Some weakness, perhaps, but nothing that would suggest a sudden collapse. And yet she died suddenly. Yes, Miss Marple considered this. And the manner of her death? Peaceful, as far as one can tell. No signs of distress, no indication of struggle. And no cause? Dr. Hayward exhaled slowly. Not one that presents itself readily. Miss Marple's eyes moved briefly to the window, then back again. I understand there was a cup of tea, she said. The doctor looked at her sharply. Yes. She had not finished it. No. Was that unusual? He paused. I cannot say with certainty, but it struck me as odd. In what way? Mrs. Harrowby was a creature of habit. She did not leave things half done. Miss Marple nodded. No, she said softly. Such people rarely do. There was a brief silence. Tell me, she continued, was there anything else? Anything at all that seemed out of place? Dr. Hayward frowned slightly as though searching his memory. There was a letter, he said at last. A letter? Yes, in the grate. Partially burned. Miss Marple's interest sharpened. Was it legible? Only fragments. It appeared to be handwritten. The rest was destroyed. And no one thought to preserve it? The doctor shifted uncomfortably. At the time it did not seem significant. Miss Marple gave a small, understanding smile. Of course, she said. Such things rarely do. From there, it was but a short walk to the general store. Mr. Calder was a tall, reserved man with a manner that suggested both patience and caution. He greeted Miss Marple politely, though with a hint of curiosity. I don't believe we've met, he said. No, Miss Marple replied, but I have heard of you. Have you indeed? Yes. You were acquainted with Mrs. Harrowby, I understand. Something in his expression shifted, very slightly, but enough. As much as anyone was, he said. And what was your impression of her? He shrugged. A private woman? Kept her affairs to herself. And yet you saw her occasionally? Yes, by arrangement. Sometimes. Miss Marple studied him quietly. And when did you last see her? 3 days ago. Was anything unusual? He hesitated. No. Miss Marple tilted her head. You hesitate. I'm merely trying to be accurate. A most admirable quality, she said gently, but not always an easy one. Mr. Calder's gaze flickered briefly toward the window. She seemed distracted, he admitted. In what way? I cannot say exactly. Preoccupied, perhaps. With something specific. I don't know. Miss Marple let the silence linger just long enough to become uncomfortable. And yet, she said softly, You feel that you do know something. Mr. Calder met her gaze, his expression guarded. I feel, he said carefully, that Mrs. Harrowby was expecting something, or someone. Miss Marple's eyes brightened almost imperceptibly. Did she say so? No. Then what led you to that conclusion? He hesitated again, then shook his head. It was nothing. A feeling. Miss Marple smiled. Feelings, she said, are often far more reliable than facts. As she stepped back into the cold air, Miss Marple drew her coat more closely around her. The village stretched out before her, serene and unchanged. But now, she thought, it had begun to speak. Not loudly, not clearly, but in small, careful ways, through half-finished cups of tea, burned letters, and the quiet hesitations of those who knew more than they wished to say. And somewhere within those small observations lay the truth, waiting, as it always did, to be noticed. Footprints that lead nowhere, snow. Miss Marple often reflected, was both a revealer and a deceiver. It had the admirable quality of recording movement with perfect honesty, each step marked, each direction preserved, and yet, at the same time, it could just as easily obscure, soften, or erase what had once been clear. A strong wind, a fresh fall, or even the passage of time could turn certainty into confusion. In Bramblewick, the snow had already begun its quiet work. Miss Marple stood near the edge of Mrs. Harrowby's property, her small boots planted carefully as she observed the ground with a thoughtful expression. Constable Briggs hovered nearby, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, uncertain whether he was assisting or merely being observed himself. I must say, he began, there's not much to see now, not like yesterday. Quite, Miss Marple replied mildly. Oh, that is often the case with important things. Briggs frowned slightly, unsure how to interpret this. We did notice footprints, he added, eager to be useful. Yesterday, I mean. Before the last snowfall. Miss Marple glanced at him. Oh? Yes, leading up to the cottage, and away from it. Well, that's just it. He hesitated. There were none. Miss Marple turned her full attention to him now. None at all? None that we could find, just a single set leading to the door, and then nothing. Miss Marple's gaze drifted back to the snow-covered path. That is rather interesting, she said. Briggs nodded, encouraged. We thought perhaps they'd been covered over. The weather's been unpredictable. Yes, Miss Marple said. The weather is often a very convenient explanation. There was a pause. You don't think that's what happened? Briggs asked. Miss Marple smiled faintly. I think, she said, that one must always be cautious of explanations that are too convenient. The path itself was now indistinct, softened by fresh snow and the passage of curious feet. But Miss Marple did not appear discouraged. Instead, she moved slowly around the perimeter of the cottage, her eyes noting small details that might have escaped a less patient observer. The windows were all closed, no sign of forced entry. The back door, Briggs explained, had been locked from the inside just as the front door had been. No other way in or out? Miss Marple asked. None that we've found. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. A locked cottage, she murmured, and footprints that lead only one way. Briggs shifted again. It does seem odd, when you put it like that. Yes, Miss Marple said gently. It does. Inside, the cottage retained its peculiar stillness. The air was faintly scented with something herbal, lavender perhaps, or rosemary. The furniture remained exactly as it had been described. Orderly, precise, untouched by chaos. Miss Marple moved slowly through the rooms, her attention lingering on small, seemingly insignificant objects. A folded shawl draped over the back of a chair. A book left open, face down, as though its reader intended to return shortly. A clock on the mantelpiece ticking steadily, indifferent to the events that had transpired. Nothing disturbed, Briggs said. That's what the doctor said as well. Miss Marple paused beside the small table where the teacup still rested. It had not been moved. The liquid inside had darkened slightly. Its surface dull and uninviting. May I? She asked. Briggs nodded. Miss Marple leaned closer, examining the cup with quiet concentration. Cold, of course, she said. Yes. And you're quite certain it was found like this? Exactly like that. Miss Marple straightened. How very curious. Briggs cleared his throat. Curious, miss. Yes, she said. You see, if Mrs. Harrowby had intended to drink her tea, she would have done so while it was still hot. Well, naturally. And if she had not intended to drink it, she would not have poured it at all, Briggs blinked. I hadn't thought of that. Few people do, Miss Marple replied kindly, which is why such things are so often overlooked. It was the fireplace that drew her next. The grate had been cleaned, though not thoroughly. A few blackened fragments remained, and were clinging stubbornly to the edges. Miss Marple crouched slightly, her eyes narrowing as she examined the remains. "This is where the letter was found?" she asked. "Yes." "Partially burned?" "That's right." Miss Marple reached out with a gloved hand, carefully lifting a small fragment. The paper was fragile, its edges curled and darkened by flame. Most of the writing had been lost, but here and there faint traces remained. "Cannot delay. Must be settled. Tonight?" Miss Marple's expression did not change, but something in her posture shifted, an almost imperceptible tightening, like a thread being drawn taut. "Most unfortunate," she murmured. "Fire is such a thorough destroyer." Briggs leaned closer. "Can you make anything of it?" "Very little," she said. "And yet, perhaps more than one might expect." They returned to the sitting room where Mrs. Harrowby had been found. The chair remained in place, though it now stood empty. Miss Marple regarded it for a long moment. "A peaceful death," she said softly. "That's what the doctor thought." "Yes," Miss Marple replied, "and yet peace can be deceptive." Briggs frowned. "In what way?" Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead, she moved toward the window, looking out at the white expanse beyond. "Tell me," she said at last, "who discovered the body?" "Dr. Hayward and myself," Briggs replied. "Mr. Pettigrew raised the alarm, but we were the first to enter." "And no one else had been inside before you?" "No," Miss Marple nodded. "And the position of the body, exactly as you described?" "Yes." She turned back to him. "And you're quite certain there were no signs of disturbance? No indication that anything had been moved?" Briggs hesitated. "Well, there was one thing." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "Yes. The chair," he said. "It was angled slightly. Not much, but enough to notice." "In what way?" "Toward the door, as if she had turned to look at something." Miss Marple was silent for a moment. "How interesting," she said quietly. When they stepped outside again, the afternoon light had begun to fade, casting long shadows across the snow. Miss Marple stood for a moment at the gate, her eyes tracing the path that led away from the cottage. "One set of footprints," she murmured, "leading to the door." Briggs nodded. "And none leading away?" "Yes." Miss Marple tapped her gloved fingers lightly against the gate-post. "Then we must ask ourselves," she said, "a very simple question." Briggs waited. "If someone came to the cottage," Miss Marple continued, "how did they leave?" The constable shifted uneasily. "Well, they must have left somehow." "Indeed," she said. "People rarely vanish into thin air." There was a pause. "Unless," Briggs ventured, "they never left at all." Miss Marple turned to him, her eyes bright with quiet interest. "My dear constable," she said, "that is a most intriguing suggestion." Briggs flushed slightly. "I didn't mean—" "On the contrary," Miss Marple interrupted gently, "you may have meant exactly what is required." She looked back at the cottage, its windows dark against the gathering dusk. "A locked room," she said softly. "A visitor who leaves no trace. A letter that speaks of urgency. And a woman who turns her chair as though expecting someone." Her gaze lingered for a moment longer. "Yes," she added, almost to herself, "it is beginning to take shape." Briggs swallowed. "Do you think it was murder?" Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead, she adjusted her gloves, her expression calm but thoughtful. "I think," she said at last, "that Mrs. Harrowby did not die alone." The wind stirred then, lifting a fine veil of snow across the path, erasing, softening, concealing. But Miss Marple, who had spent a lifetime observing the smallest of human details, knew that what had already been revealed was quite enough. The question was no longer whether something had happened. It was who had been there to see it through, and more importantly, who had walked into the cottage and never walked out again. The nature of quiet people. There is a particular kind of person, Miss Marple often thought, who attracts secrets without ever appearing to seek them. They listen more than they speak, observe more than they reveal, and possess the rare ability to make others feel that what they say will not be judged too harshly. Miss Evesham, the schoolteacher, was not that kind of person. She was, in fact, quite the opposite. Miss Marple noticed this almost immediately when she entered the small schoolhouse at the far end of the village. It was a neat, orderly place, its rows of desks aligned with almost military precision. The blackboard had been freshly cleaned, though faint traces of arithmetic still lingered, as if reluctant to be entirely erased. Miss Evesham herself stood near the window, her posture straight, her expression composed to the point of severity. "You wish to speak with me?" she said. Her tone was polite, but not warm. Miss Marple smiled gently. "If you would be so kind, I understand you are acquainted with Mrs. Harrowby." Miss Evesham inclined her head. "Yes, we had an understanding." "How nice," Miss Marple said. "Those can be so valuable." There was a brief pause. "In what sense?" Miss Evesham asked. "Oh, in all senses," Miss Marple replied lightly. "Particularly in a village, where one must rely upon others for so many small things." Miss Evesham did not smile. "I visited her occasionally," she said. "To read mostly. She had a preference for certain authors, though her eyesight had begun to fail." "How kind of you." "It was a practical arrangement." Miss Marple nodded. "And when did you last see her?" 2 evenings ago." Miss Marple's eyes flickered. "Indeed? That is quite recent." "Yes." "Was she well?" Miss Evesham hesitated. "She was, as she usually was." "And that is?" "Reserved." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "Only reserved?" Miss Evesham's lips pressed together. She was not a woman who encouraged familiarity. "No," Miss Marple agreed softly. "And yet she allowed you to visit." "Yes," which suggests a degree of trust. Miss Evesham's gaze shifted almost imperceptibly. "Perhaps." Miss Marple let the silence stretch for a moment. "Did anything unusual occur during your visit?" she asked. "No." The answer came too quickly. Miss Marple did not challenge it directly. Instead, she moved toward the window, glancing out at the snow-covered yard where a few children had begun to gather. "Ah, it is curious," she said. "How often the ordinary can conceal the extraordinary." Miss Evesham said nothing. Miss Marple turned back. "You did not notice anything? A letter, perhaps? Or a change in her manner?" Miss Evesham's composure faltered, just for a moment. "There was a letter," she said at last. Miss Marple's expression remained calm. "Yes?" "It arrived while I was there. She seemed unsettled by it." "In what way?" She did not say, but she stopped reading, folded the letter very carefully, and then placed it in the fire. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "Immediately?" "Yes." "How very decisive." Miss Evesham folded her hands. She was a decisive woman. Miss Marple studied her quietly. "And after that?" "She asked me to leave." "Unusual?" "Yes." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Did she seem afraid?" Miss Evesham hesitated again. "I would not say afraid," she said, "but concerned." "Concerned," Miss Marple repeated. "That is a most interesting word." If Miss Evesham was a woman who held herself tightly, Mrs. Larkins was quite the opposite. Miss Marple found her in a small cottage near the centre of the village, where the air was warm and the kettle perpetually on the boil. Mrs. Larkins welcomed her with immediate enthusiasm, her curiosity only thinly disguised as hospitality. "Well now," she said, bustling about with cups and saucers, "you've come about Mrs. Harrowby, I don't doubt." Miss Marple smiled. "I thought it might be useful to hear your perspective." "My perspective!" Mrs. Larkins exclaimed. "Well, I've plenty of that, I can tell you." "I am sure you have." Mrs. Larkins settled into her chair with evident satisfaction. "I worked for her, you know. Once a week. Cleaning, tidying, that sort of thing." "Yes, I understand you stopped." Mrs. Larkins sniffed. "Her doing, not mine." "Indeed?" "Oh, yes. Said she preferred to manage on her own. Though I'll tell you this, she didn't trust easily, that one." Miss Marple's eyes flickered. "No? No. Always watching. Always noticing. You couldn't move so much as a cushion without her knowing." "How very observant." Mrs. Larkins leaned forward. "And particular. Everything had its place. Everything done just so." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And yet she dismissed you." "Yes." "After how long?" "Nearly a year." Miss Marple considered this. "That suggests something more than mere preference." Mrs. Larkins hesitated, then lowered her voice. "There was a disagreement." Over arrangements? Mrs. Larkins gave a short laugh. That's one way of putting it. And another? Mrs. Larkins glanced toward the door, though it was firmly closed. She accused me of moving things, she said. Moving things? Yes, said I'd been through her drawers, reading her papers. Had you? Of course not, Mrs. Larkins said, with perhaps a touch too much emphasis. I'm not that sort. Miss Marple regarded her kindly. Of course. Mrs. Larkins shifted slightly. Well, perhaps I tidied a little more thoroughly than she liked. But there was nothing in it. Nothing at all. Miss Marple smiled faintly. No, she said. I am sure there was not. It was late afternoon by the time Miss Marple returned to Mrs. Fenwick's house. The light had begun to fade again, casting the village in soft shades of blue and grey. The snow reflected what little light remained, giving everything an almost unreal clarity. Mrs. Fenwick looked up eagerly as Miss Marple entered. Well, she said, have you discovered anything? Miss Marple removed her gloves with deliberate care. I have discovered, she said, that Mrs. Harrowby was a woman of strong habits, considerable caution, and selective trust. Mrs. Fenwick blinked. Yes, I believe that is generally agreed, and that shortly before her death she received a letter that caused her some concern. Oh, yes, a letter she chose to destroy. How very strange. Not entirely, Miss Marple said. People often destroy what they fear others might read. Mrs. Fenwick shivered slightly. You think it was something serious? Miss Marple sat down by the fire. I think, she said slowly, that it was something she believed required immediate action. Mrs. Fenwick leaned forward. What sort of action? Miss Marple looked into the flames, her expression thoughtful. The sort, she said quietly, that brings someone out into the snow on a winter's evening. There was a silence. You mean she was expecting a visitor? Mrs. Fenwick asked. Yes. And that visitor? Miss Marple raised a hand gently. We must not rush, she said. There are still many small things to consider. Such as? Miss Marple smiled faintly. Such as why a woman who trusted so few would admit someone into her home at night. Mrs. Fenwick's eyes widened. And why, Miss Marple continued, that same woman would turn her chair toward the door, as though waiting. The fire crackled softly, and most importantly, Miss Marple added, why that visitor left no trace of their departure. Mrs. Fenwick shivered again. It sounds almost impossible. Miss Marple's smile deepened slightly. Not impossible, she said. Merely improbable. She leaned back in her chair, her gaze distant. In my experience, the improbable is simply the probable, waiting to be understood. Outside, the village settled into evening once more. Lights appeared in windows, doors were closed against the cold, and the quiet returned. But now, beneath that quiet, something else had taken root. A question, not yet answered, but growing, slowly and steadily, toward the truth. The man who waited. If there was one thing Miss Marple valued above all else, it was patience. Not the passive sort, which merely endured time, but the active kind. The quiet, watchful patience that allowed truths to reveal themselves in their own way. People, she had long believed, were very much like clocks. They could be wound, they could be set, but in the end they moved according to their own inner mechanisms, and if one waited long enough, they would strike. Mr. Calder, she thought, was precisely that sort of clock. The general store stood at the heart of Bramblewick, its windows faintly fogged from the warmth inside. It was a place where conversations lingered longer than necessary, and where small details exchanged over purchases of tea or sugar often carried more weight than they appeared to. Miss Marple entered quietly. A bell above the door gave a soft chime, and Mr. Calder looked up from behind the counter. Miss Marple, he said, with a polite inclination of his head. Back again? Yes, she replied. I hope I'm not interrupting. Not at all. There were no other customers. Miss Marple moved slowly between the shelves, her eyes drifting over neatly arranged goods, jars, tins, folded paper packets. Everything was in order, much like the man who kept it. You run a very efficient establishment, she said. I do my best. I'm sure you do. She paused, then turned toward him. I wonder if I might trouble you with a few more questions. Mr. Calder's expression remained composed. If I can be of assistance. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "You mentioned yesterday that Mrs. Harrowby seemed to be expecting someone." "Yes." "And that this was merely a feeling." "That is correct," Miss Marple nodded. "I have always found," she said gently, "that feelings of that sort rarely arise without cause." Mr. Calder did not respond immediately. Instead, he reached for a cloth and began wiping the counter, a gesture that, to Miss Marple's practised eye, suggested not cleanliness but hesitation. "She asked me a question," he said at last. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "Oh? Yes? What sort of question?" He paused, then met her eyes. "She asked if I believed a person could truly leave their past behind." Miss Marple considered this. "And what did you say?" "That it depended on the past." A very sensible answer. He gave a slight shrug. She did not seem satisfied. "In what way?" She pressed the matter, wanted to know if... He stopped. "If," Miss Marple prompted softly, "if certain things could be forgotten, or forgiven." Miss Marple was silent for a moment. "And what did you tell her then?" Mr. Calder's jaw tightened slightly. "I told her that some things have a way of returning, no matter how far one goes." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Yes," she said. "That has been my observation as well." There was a pause during which the ticking of a small clock on the wall became unexpectedly noticeable. "And did she say anything else?" Miss Marple asked. Mr. Calder hesitated. "She asked if I thought people could change." Miss Marple's expression softened. "And what did you think?" He gave a short, humourless smile. "I thought she was asking the wrong question." "Oh, yes. It is not whether people change that matters. It is whether they wish to." Miss Marple regarded him with quiet interest. "And Mrs. Harrowby?" "She did not say." Miss Marple nodded. "Of course. She made a small purchase, a packet of tea, though she hardly needed it, and allowed the conversation to drift toward more ordinary matters before taking her leave. But as she stepped back into the cold air, her thoughts remained firmly fixed on what had been said and what had not. A question about the past, a concern about forgiveness, a letter that spoke of urgency, and a visitor expected on a winter's evening. It was, she thought, beginning to form a pattern. That pattern became more distinct later that day, when Miss Marple encountered Dr. Hayward once more. He had come to call on Mrs. Fenwick, but found himself instead drawn into conversation by Miss Marple, who had a way of asking questions that felt less like inquiries and more like gentle invitations. "I've been thinking about Mrs. Harrowby," she said. "As have we all," the doctor replied. "And I wonder, did she ever speak to you of her past?" Dr. Hayward frowned slightly. "Not in detail. She was not inclined to discuss such matters. But she mentioned it, occasionally." "In passing." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "In what way?" The doctor hesitated. "She once referred to it as a mistake that could not be undone." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "How very definitive." "Yes." "And did she elaborate?" "No." Miss Marple nodded. "Did you ever inquire further?" "It did not seem appropriate." "Quite," Miss Marple said gently, "though one cannot help but be curious." Dr. Hayward gave a faint, uneasy smile. "Yes, one cannot." There was a brief silence. "And in your opinion," Miss Marple continued, "was she a woman who feared something?" Dr. Hayward considered this carefully. "I would not say feared," he said at last, "but she was cautious." "In what sense?" "She avoided certain topics, certain people." "Which people?" He hesitated. "I could not say with certainty." Miss Marple's gaze lingered on him. "But you have an impression." "Yes." "And that impression is?" "That she believed someone might come looking for her." Miss Marple sat back slowly. "How very interesting." Evening came early, as it often did in winter. By the time Miss Marple returned to her room, the village was already settling into darkness. The fire burned low, casting soft shadows across the walls, and the quiet seemed deeper than before. She sat by the window, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her mind turning over the day's observations. A woman with a past she would not discuss, a letter that disturbed her, a question about forgiveness, a visitor she expected, and a death that, while peaceful in appearance, carried the faintest suggestion of something unresolved. Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "Forgiveness," she murmured. It was a curious thing, and some people sought it desperately, others refused it entirely, and still others, she thought, believed they had earned it, when in fact they had not. She rose slowly and moved toward the fire, her expression thoughtful. If someone wished to confront Mrs. Harrowby, she said softly to herself, they would need a reason. And not just any reason, a personal one, something rooted not in opportunity but in history. She paused. Yes, she added quietly, history. Outside, the wind stirred again, lifting the snow into faint shifting patterns. And somewhere within that shifting whiteness, Miss Marple felt certain, lay the answer. Not in the obvious, not in the convenient, but in the past that had followed Mrs. Harrowby all the way to Bramblewick, waiting, as such things always did, for the moment when it could no longer be ignored. Chasse qui, the shape of a secret. There are, Miss Marple believed, two kinds of secrets. The first are those carefully constructed, hidden deliberately, guarded with intention, and revealed only under pressure. These are the secrets people expect to find. The second kind are quieter. They do not announce themselves. They slip into ordinary conversation, hide within small habits, and reveal themselves only through inconsistency. They are not so much concealed as overlooked. It was this second kind that Miss Marple now suspected lay at the heart of Mrs. Harrowby's death. The following morning brought with it a pale sun and a deceptive brightness that made the snow appear almost welcoming. The village, encouraged by the clearer weather, had grown slightly more animated. Doors opened more readily, conversations lingered a little longer, and the careful restraint that had followed the discovery of the body began ever so slightly to loosen. Miss Marple chose her moment well. Mrs. Fenwick had mentioned in passing that Mr. Pettigrew, the milkman, was a man who noticed more than he said. Such people, Miss Marple knew, were often invaluable. She found him at the edge of the village, tending to his cart. He looked up as she approached, his expression polite but cautious. "Good morning," she said. "Morning, miss. I hope you will forgive me for troubling you, but I understand you were the first to notice that something was amiss at Mrs. Harrowby's cottage." He shifted slightly, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. "I just saw the milk hadn't been taken in," he said. "That's all." "And that struck you as unusual?" "Well, yes." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Routine is a very powerful thing," she said. "When it changes, one notices." He nodded. "That's right." Miss Marple clasped her hands. "I wonder, did you notice anything else that morning? Anything at all out of the ordinary?" Mr. Pettigrew hesitated. "Not really." Miss Marple did not press. Instead, she let a small silence form, her expression patient, encouraging. People she knew often filled silences when they felt they should. "Well," he added at last, "there was one thing." Miss Marple's eyes lifted slightly. "Yes." "The gate." "The gate." "It was open." Miss Marple considered this. "And is that unusual?" He scratched his chin. "She usually kept it shut. Not locked, mind you, but closed." "And that morning?" "Wide open." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "How very interesting." There was a pause. "And the path?" she asked. "You mentioned footprints." "Yes." "Could you describe them?" Mr. Pettigrew shifted his weight again. "Just one set, leading up to the door. And none leading away?" "That's right." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "And you're quite certain of that?" "Yes." She studied him for a moment. "Were they clear?" "Clear enough." "Large? Small?" He hesitated. "I didn't pay that much attention." "Of course," Miss Marple said kindly. "One rarely does at the time." He looked faintly apologetic. "But they were there," he added. "I'm sure of that." "I have no doubt." Miss Marple thanked him and continued on her way, her thoughts quietly assembling themselves. An open gate, a single set of footprints, a visitor expected, a letter destroyed. Each detail on its own might have seemed insignificant. Together, they began to suggest something more deliberate. It was shortly after midday that Miss Marple paid a second visit to the cottage. Constable Briggs, though still uncertain of her exact role in the matter, had by now developed a certain respect for her observations. He met her at the gate with a nod that carried a hint of deference. "Back again, miss?" "Yes," she replied. "If you don't mind." "Not at all." The cottage felt different now, not in any obvious way. Its contents remained unchanged, its stillness intact. But there was a subtle shift in perception. What had once seemed merely quiet now felt intentional, as though the silence itself had been arranged. Miss Marple moved slowly through the rooms once more, her attention focused not on what was present, but on what might be missing. "Tell me," she said. "Was anything removed from the cottage after Mrs. Harrowby's death?" Briggs frowned. "Removed?" "Yes. Personal items, perhaps. Papers," he shook his head. "Not that I know of. Everything seemed to be in order." "Seemed to be," Miss Marple repeated softly. She paused beside a small writing desk in the corner of the sitting room. It was neat. Too neat, perhaps. A single pen rested in its holder. A stack of paper lay perfectly aligned. A small drawer stood slightly ajar. Miss Marple reached out and opened it fully. Inside there was very little. A few envelopes, some folded documents, and an absence. She closed the drawer again. "How very careful," she murmured. Briggs looked at her. "Miss?" "Nothing," she said lightly. "Merely a thought." It was the window that held her attention next. From the chair where Mrs. Harrowby had been found, one could see the path clearly, the gate, the approach, the faint curve of the lane beyond. Miss Marple stood there for a long moment, imagining. A woman seated, waiting, watching, expecting. Her gaze shifted slightly. "To the door," she said. Briggs nodded. "That's how the chair was angled." "Yes," Miss Marple stepped back. "And yet," she continued, "if she was expecting someone, she would not have been surprised by their arrival." Briggs frowned. "No," which suggests, Miss Marple said softly, that whatever happened occurred after they had entered. There was a silence, and no signs of struggle, Briggs said. "No," Miss Marple agreed, "which is most significant." She turned slowly, her eyes moving once more over the room. "A visitor," she said. "Admitted willingly. A conversation. Perhaps a disagreement." Briggs shifted uneasily. "And then?" Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead, she moved back toward the fireplace, her gaze lingering on the grate. "A letter burned," she said, "a past revisited, and a question of forgiveness." She looked up. "Yes," she added quietly. "That seems most likely." As they stepped outside again, the afternoon had begun to fade. The snow, though still bright, carried a faint greyness now, as though the day itself were withdrawing. Miss Marple paused at the gate. "Open," she said softly. Briggs looked at it. "Yes. Left that way, perhaps. Or opened by the visitor," he suggested. Miss Marple nodded. "Indeed." She turned, her gaze sweeping the path once more. "One set of footprints," she murmured. Briggs hesitated. "You're still thinking about that?" "Yes. Why?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Because," she said, "it is not the presence of the footprints that interests me. No? No." She looked at him directly. "It is their absence." Briggs blinked. "I'm not sure I follow." Miss Marple's smile deepened slightly. "That," she said gently, "is quite all right." She adjusted her gloves, her expression calm but thoughtful. "In time, I believe it will become clear." That evening, as the village settled once more into its winter quiet, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her mind tracing the delicate outline of a secret that had yet to fully reveal itself. A woman with something to hide, a visitor with something to claim, a meeting that had been arranged, or perhaps demanded, and a departure that left no trace. She closed her eyes briefly. "Yes," she murmured. It was not yet complete, but it was no longer shapeless. The truth, she thought, was beginning to take form, not in bold strokes but in the smallest of details, and like all such truths, it would reveal itself not through what was said, but through what could not be explained away, the weight of what was not said. There are moments, Miss Marple believed, when truth does not advance, it gathers. Like snow upon a branch, it accumulates quietly, delicately, until the weight becomes too much to bear, and then, quite suddenly, it falls. Bramblewick, she felt, was nearing such a moment. It began, as many important things do, with something seemingly insignificant. Mrs. Fenwick had invited a small gathering that evening. Nothing formal, merely a few familiar faces brought together under the pretence of warmth and company. In winter, such gatherings were common enough, though Miss Marple suspected that curiosity had played no small part in the invitations. "Just a few neighbours," Mrs. Fenwick said, adjusting the arrangement of cups on a tray. "It does one good to talk, especially after everything." Miss Marple agreed. "Yes," she said gently. "People often reveal more in company than they intend." Mrs. Fenwick gave a small, uncertain laugh. "I do hope nothing unpleasant is revealed." Miss Marple did not answer directly. The guests arrived shortly after dusk. Mr. Calder came, his manner as reserved as ever. Miss Evesham followed, her posture as precise as the lines on her blackboard. Dr. Hayward was there as well, along with Constable Briggs, who seemed faintly uncomfortable in a social setting that required more conversation than authority. Mrs. Larkins arrived last, bringing with her an air of barely contained anticipation. The room filled with quiet voices, the clink of teacups, and the soft crackle of the fire. Miss Marple sat slightly apart, her knitting resting idly in her lap, her eyes attentive though her demeanour remained entirely unassuming. It was, she knew, the perfect position. Conversation began harmlessly enough. The weather, the state of the roads, the inconvenience of delayed deliveries. But such topics, Miss Marple observed, rarely held attention for long, not when something more compelling lay just beneath the surface. It was Mrs. Larkins who first ventured closer. "Such a dreadful thing," she said, lowering her voice just enough to suggest importance. "To die alone like that." "Peacefully," Dr. Hayward added. "Yes, well," Mrs. Larkins replied. "Peaceful or not, it's not natural." "Is it?" "Not really." Miss Evesham's gaze flickered. "I see no reason to suppose otherwise," she said. Mrs. Larkins sniffed. "Don't you? Well, perhaps you know more than the rest of us." The remark hung in the air, light but pointed. Miss Evesham's expression tightened. "I know only what I have been told." "And what is that?" Mrs. Larkins pressed. "That Mrs. Harrowby died of natural causes." Without finishing her tea, Mrs. Larkins said. There was a brief silence. Miss Marple did not look up, but she noticed the subtle shift in the room, the slight tension, the unspoken awareness that something had been touched upon. "How curious," she said lightly, as though the thought had only just occurred to her. A person so particular about routine, leaving something unfinished. Dr. Hayward cleared his throat. "As I have said, it may mean nothing." "Of course," Miss Marple replied. "It may mean nothing at all." The conversation drifted again, but not far. Mr. Calder spoke little, though his attention seemed fixed more on the others than on his own tea. Miss Evesham remained composed, though a certain rigidity had crept into her posture. Mrs. Larkins, for her part, appeared determined not to let the matter rest. "It's the letter that interests me," she said. Miss Marple's needles paused mid-air. "The letter?" she repeated. "Yes, the one she burned." Miss Evesham looked sharply at her. "How do you know about that?" Mrs. Larkins gave a small, satisfied smile. "Oh, people talk." Miss Marple lowered her knitting slightly. "And what have they said?" she asked. "That it came just before she died, that it upset her." Miss Marple inclined her head. "That does seem likely." Mrs. Larkins leaned forward. "And that it mentioned someone coming to see her." There was a silence, this one deeper, more deliberate. Miss Marple felt it settle, like the first real weight upon the branch. "Did it?" she asked softly. Mrs. Larkins shrugged. "That's what I've heard." Miss Evesham's voice cut in, sharp and controlled. "You have heard incorrectly." All eyes turned to her. "The contents of the letter are not known," she said. "It was destroyed." Mrs. Larkins raised an eyebrow. "Not entirely." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened, though her expression remained mild. "Oh?" Mrs. Larkins nodded. "There were fragments, weren't there? Words left behind." Dr. Hayward shifted uncomfortably. "Only partial ones." "Still," Mrs. Larkins said, "enough to suggest something urgent." Miss Marple set her knitting aside. "Yes," she said quietly, "urgent enough to require action that very evening." The room had grown noticeably still. Even Mrs. Fenwick, who had intended only a pleasant gathering, now sat silently, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "And yet," Miss Marple continued, her tone gentle but precise, "we are left with a rather peculiar situation." Constable Briggs shifted. "In what way?" Miss Marple looked around the room. A woman receives a letter that disturbs her. She burns it. She expects a visitor. She admits that visitor into her home. She paused. "And then she dies." No one spoke. "And the visitor?" Miss Marple went on. She let the question linger. "There are footprints leading to the cottage," she said, "but none leading away." Briggs nodded slowly. "That's right." Miss Marple's gaze moved from one face to another. "So we must ask ourselves, what became of that visitor?" The silence deepened. Mrs. Larkins shifted in her seat. "Well, they must have left somehow." "Must they?" Miss Marple asked gently. It was a small question, quiet, unassuming, and yet it seemed to alter something in the room. Mr. Calder's hand tightened slightly around his cup. Miss Eversham's gaze dropped just for a moment. Dr. Hayward looked toward the fire as though seeking reassurance in its steady glow. Miss Marple watched them all. "Let us consider the possibilities," she said. "Either the visitor left by some means that left no trace." "Or," Briggs prompted. "Or," Miss Marple said softly, "they never left at all." The words settled heavily. Mrs. Fenwick gave a faint involuntary gasp. "That's absurd," Miss Eversham said quickly. "Is it?" Miss Marple asked. "Yes. The cottage was searched." "Thoroughly?" "Of course." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "And yet," she said, "no explanation has been found." Miss Eversham did not respond. Miss Marple leaned back, her expression thoughtful rather than accusatory. "I do not suggest," she said, "that we leap to conclusions, only that we remain open to possibilities." She reached for her knitting once more, her movements calm and unhurried. "After all," she added, "it is often what is not said that proves most revealing." The conversation, after that, struggled to recover its earlier ease. Voices resumed, but with less certainty. Laughter, when it came, felt forced. Each person seemed slightly more aware of the others, and of themselves. Miss Marple, for her part, said very little, but she observed. Mr. Calder left early, offering a polite but brief excuse. Miss Eversham remained a little longer, though her composure now seemed more deliberate than natural. Dr. Hayward lingered by the fire, his thoughts clearly elsewhere, and Mrs. Larkins, though outwardly satisfied, watched the others with a curiosity that bordered on calculation. When at last the guests had gone, Mrs. Fenwick turned to Miss Marple with wide eyes. "My dear Miss Marple," she said, "what an extraordinary evening." "Was it?" Miss Marple replied mildly. "You don't think—" Mrs. Fenwick hesitated. "You don't truly believe that someone might still be in the cottage?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "No," she said, "not quite." Mrs. Fenwick exhaled in relief. "Oh, thank goodness." Miss Marple rose slowly, moving toward the window. "But I do believe," she added, "that someone has not yet left this matter behind." Mrs. Fenwick blinked. "I'm not sure I understand." Miss Marple looked out into the night, where the snow lay undisturbed beneath the pale glow of moonlight. "That," she said gently, "is precisely the point." Somewhere in Bramblewick a truth had shifted, not revealed, not yet, but unsettled, and like snow poised upon a branch it would not remain suspended forever. Sooner or later it would fall, and when it did, it would reveal exactly who had been carrying the weight all along. A matter of timing. If there was one principle Miss Marple trusted above most others, it was this. Time, when properly understood, rarely lied. People did, of course, quite often in fact. They misremembered, exaggerated, concealed, and occasionally convinced themselves of things that had never happened at all. But time, when examined through action, habit, and sequence, possessed a quiet honesty. And in the matter of Mrs. Harrowby's death, time had begun to behave rather strangely. The morning after Mrs. Fenwick's gathering dawned colder than before. A thin frost had formed over the previous day's snow, giving it a brittle, crystalline texture that crunched sharply underfoot. Miss Marple welcomed the change. Fresh snow obscured, frozen snow preserved. She set out early. Her first stop was the church. Not for prayer, though she did pause briefly in the quiet interior, but for conversation. The church, like the general store, was a place where information settled, sometimes gently, sometimes not. Reverend Pritchard was a mild, observant man, whose chief virtue lay in his ability to listen without appearing to do so. "Miss Marple," he said, greeting her warmly. "A pleasure." "And to you," she replied. I hope I do not intrude. Not at all. They spoke first of ordinary things, the weather, the small inconveniences of winter, but Miss Marple, with her usual subtlety, guided the conversation toward more relevant matters. Mrs. Harrowby attended services, she asked. Occasionally, the Reverend replied. Not regularly, but enough to be noted. And did she confide in you? He hesitated. Not in the usual sense, Miss Marple nodded. Some people prefer to carry their burdens privately. Yes. And yet, she continued gently, they often reveal something, even if unintentionally. Reverend Pritchard considered this. She once asked me, he said slowly, whether confession without true repentance held any value. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened slightly. How did you answer? I told her that confession is only meaningful when accompanied by a desire to change. And did she seem satisfied? No. Miss Marple inclined her head. How very interesting. By the time she left the church, the outline of Mrs. Harrowby's state of mind had grown clearer. A troubled past, a question of forgiveness, a letter that prompted immediate action. And now, a concern about confession without repentance. It was, Miss Marple thought, a most revealing combination. Her next visit was less expected. Miss Marple returned to Mrs. Larkins. If the former housekeeper had been talkative before, she was positively animated now. Well, she exclaimed, ushering Miss Marple inside. There's been all sorts of talk since last night. I can imagine, Miss Marple said. Mrs. Larkins leaned forward eagerly. That business about the footprints, people are saying it's unnatural. People often say that when they do not understand something, Miss Marple replied calmly. Yes, well, there's more. More? Mrs. Larkins lowered her voice. I've been thinking about the night she died. Miss Marple's expression remained mild. Have you indeed? Yes, and I remembered something. Miss Marple waited. There was a light, Mrs. Larkins said. A light? In the cottage. Late. How late? After 10, I'd say. I was passing by, well, not passing exactly, but near enough, and I saw it through the window. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. You are quite certain of the time? As certain as I can be. And was that unusual? Mrs. Larkins nodded. She didn't often stay up late, not that I ever saw. Miss Marple considered this carefully. And did you see anything else? Mrs. Larkins hesitated. I thought I saw movement. In what sense? A shadow, not just hers. Miss Marple's hands folded neatly in her lap. You believe she was not alone? I can't say for certain, Mrs. Larkins said quickly. But it looked that way. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Yes, she said. I think it did. The importance of this detail did not lie in its certainty, but in its timing. After 10, later than expected, and crucially, later than anyone had previously mentioned. Miss Marple returned to the cottage once more that afternoon, this time alone. The key had been left with Constable Briggs, who by now had ceased to question her interest. Inside, the air felt colder than before, not physically perhaps, but in a way that suggested absence, something once present, now gone. Miss Marple moved directly to the sitting room. She stood by the chair, looked at the table, the teacup still half full. She tilted her head slightly. A matter of timing, she murmured. She moved to the fireplace again, her gaze resting on the blackened fragments. A letter burned, not completely, but deliberately. She turned, her eyes scanning the room. Then, slowly, she crossed to the small clock on the mantelpiece. It ticked steadily, unremarkable, and yet... Miss Marple leaned closer. A curious thing, she said softly. When Constable Briggs returned later that afternoon, he found her standing in the same position, her expression thoughtful. Miss Marple? She turned. Ah, Constable. Tell me, when you found the body, was the clock running? Briggs frowned. The clock? Yes. I believe so. Why? Miss Marple smiled faintly. No reason. Only a thought. There was a pause. You found something, Briggs said. Miss Marple considered him. I have found, she said carefully, that time, in this case, does not align as it should. I don't follow. No, she said gently. But you will. She moved toward the door. Mrs. Larkins saw a light after 10, she said. Briggs nodded. So she claims. And yet, Miss Marple continued, everything suggests that Mrs. Harrowby's evening followed a much earlier pattern. How so? She made tea, sat by the fire, expected a visitor. Yes, and if that visitor arrived at the expected time, then everything happened earlier, Briggs finished. Precisely, he frowned. But if the light was on later, then something did not occur when we think it did. The realization settled slowly. You mean, Briggs began, then stopped. Miss Marple looked at him. I mean, she said, that we must reconsider not only what happened, but when. Outside, the light was already beginning to fade. The day, like the truth, seemed to be narrowing towards something inevitable. Miss Marple paused at the gate, her gaze lingering on the path once more. A meeting, she said softly. A delay, and an action taken at the wrong time. Briggs shifted uneasily. You think someone stayed longer than they should have? Miss Marple's smile was faint. I think, she said, that someone remained long enough to ensure a particular outcome. That evening, as the village settled once more into its winter silence, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her thoughts now moving with greater clarity. Time. It was always time. Not the hour on the clock, but the sequence, the order, the moment when one thing became another. She closed her eyes briefly. Yes, she murmured. The truth was no longer distant. It was close, very close. And when it came, it would not be sudden. It would be inevitable, because everything that had been hidden was now beginning to fall into place, not with noise, not with drama, but with the quiet certainty of something that had always been there, waiting to be understood. The pattern revealed. There comes a point in every investigation, Miss Marple believed, when the facts cease to be separate things and begin instead to arrange themselves, not neatly, not at first, but with a certain inevitability, like pieces of a puzzle that, once turned the right way, no longer resist one another. By the morning of the 9th day, Bramblewick had reached that point. Miss Marple sat at the small writing desk in her room, her hands folded lightly before her. A sheet of paper lay untouched, though it was not writing she required. The act of arranging her thoughts had already been done, quietly, carefully in the spaces between conversations. Now, it was merely a matter of confirmation. She began, as she often did, with the simplest elements. Mrs. Harrowby had received a letter that disturbed her, a letter that spoke, at least in part, of urgency. Must be settled. Tonight. Miss Marple nodded slightly. Yes, she murmured, a meeting arranged. The visitor had come. Of that there was no longer any doubt. The footprints confirmed it. The open gate suggested expectation rather than intrusion. The angled chair indicated that Mrs. Harrowby had been watching, waiting for someone she knew. Admitted willingly, no struggle, no alarm. Miss Marple's fingers tapped lightly against the desk. Trust, she said softly, or something like it. And yet, the visitor had not left, or rather, had left without leaving evidence. No footprints, no trace. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. Which is not the same thing, she added. She rose and moved slowly to the window. The village lay quiet beneath a thin veil of frost, so ordinary, so composed. And yet, within that quiet, every detail now seemed to carry meaning. Time, that was the key. Not the hour recorded, not the assumed sequence, but the actual order of events. Mrs. Larkins had seen a light after 10, a shadow, movement, which meant... Miss Marple turned back into the room. It did not end when we thought it did. She moved again, this time toward the small fireplace, where the embers glowed faintly. Tea, she said. The cup had been half full, untouched, cold, a simple detail, but not a meaningless one. If she had died suddenly, Miss Marple continued, the tea would have been in her hand, or spilled. She paused, but it was neither. She sat again. Which means, she said slowly, that she did not drink it because something interrupted her. A knock at the door, perhaps, a voice, a presence she had expected, but perhaps not welcomed entirely. Miss Marple's gaze shifted slightly. The chair was turned, she said, toward the door. Yes, she had been waiting, and when the visitor arrived, she had turned, not in surprise, but in recognition. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly, and then they spoke. The conversation she imagined would not have been brief, not with such a letter, not with such a past. There would have been questions, accusations, perhaps even pleas, forgiveness asked for, or refused. She opened her eyes, and at some point, she said quietly, something changed. There had been no struggle, no sign of violence, no indication of force, which left. Miss Marple's gaze fell once more upon the empty teacup in her mind. Something subtle, she said. Poison. The word formed itself naturally, not dramatic, not immediate, but effective, given without suspicion, accepted without question. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Yes, she said. That would explain the stillness, the absence of alarm, the appearance of peace. But even that was not enough, because if poison had been given, then why remain? Why stay until after 10? Why risk being seen? Miss Marple's fingers tightened slightly. Because something had to be done, she said. Oh, the letter. Burned, but not entirely. Fragments left behind. Cannot delay. Must be settled. Tonight. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. Yes, she said. Settled. Not merely a meeting, a resolution. Final, irrevocable. She rose once more. And after it was done, she continued, there remained a problem. The visitor had arrived. That was known. But their departure had to be concealed. Miss Marple moved slowly across the room, her thoughts now clear, precise. No footprints leaving, she said, which means... She stopped, and smiled, just slightly. They did not leave by the path. The solution when it came was not dramatic. It rarely was. It simply fit. Every detail, every inconsistency, every small overlooked thing. Miss Marple turned toward the door. Yes, she said softly. That is how it was done. The next step, she knew, was inevitable. Not discovery. That had already occurred. But revelation, and for that she would need them all. That afternoon, Miss Marple sent word through Mrs. Fenwick, a simple invitation, another gathering, nothing formal, merely a request for company. They will come, she said quietly. Mrs. Fenwick, though puzzled, did not question her. Yes, she said. Of course they will. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Yes, she repeated. They always do. As evening approached, the village once again prepared itself for quiet. Lights appeared in windows, doors were closed. The world, it seemed, was settling. But Miss Marple knew better. This was not an ending. Not yet. It was a beginning. Of truth. Of consequence. Of the moment when what had been hidden could no longer remain so. She stood by the window, her hands folded neatly, her expression calm. Everything is in place, she murmured. And somewhere, not far away, someone, she felt certain, already knew it. The truth in the room. Miss Marple had always believed that the truth, once properly understood, did not require force. It required only the right moment. Mrs. Fenwick's sitting room, so recently the site of uneasy conversation, now held a different kind of stillness. The fire burned steadily, casting a warm glow that contrasted sharply with the cold certainty gathering in the room. They had all come. Mr. Calder stood near the mantel, his posture composed but his gaze distant. Miss Evesham sat upright, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her expression controlled to the point of strain. Dr. Hayward lingered near the fire, his unease more visible now than before. Mrs. Larkins occupied her chair with an air of expectant curiosity, though even she seemed aware that this was no ordinary gathering. Constable Briggs stood slightly apart, uncertain but attentive, and Miss Marple, as always, sat quietly at the centre of it all. "I am most grateful to you for coming," she said gently. "I fear I must ask your patience for a short while, as there are one or two matters that require clarification." No one spoke. Miss Marple folded her hands. "We are all agreed, I think, on the essential facts," she continued. "Mrs. Harrowby received a letter. She expected a visitor. That visitor came." She paused. "And yet we are left with certain inconsistencies." Her gaze moved calmly from one face to another, the unfinished tea, the burned letter, the absence of footprints leaving the cottage. A slight shift in the room. Each of these, taken alone, might be explained away, but together, she allowed the thought to linger. They suggest something rather more deliberate. Miss Marple rose slowly. "Let us begin with the simplest question," she said. "How does one leave a cottage without leaving footprints in the snow?" Constable Briggs shifted. "That's what we've all been wondering," Miss Marple smiled faintly. "And the answer, I think, is quite straightforward." She turned slightly, her gaze resting on the window. "One does not leave by the path." A silence fell. Mr. Calder's expression tightened, almost imperceptibly. Miss Evesham did not move. Mrs. Larkins leaned forward slightly. "You mean another way out?" she said. "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "Another way." She turned back. "The cottage has a rear entrance, less frequently used." Partially sheltered," Briggs frowned. "We checked that." "Yes," Miss Marple said gently, "but not the right time." There was a pause. "You see," she continued, "timing is everything." Her voice remained soft, but there was a quiet firmness now. Mrs. Harrowby expected her visitor in the early evening. She prepared tea, she waited. Miss Evesham's hands tightened slightly. When the visitor arrived, she admitted them. There was no struggle, no alarm, only conversation. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. A conversation about the past. She took a step forward. A past that Mrs. Harrowby believed she had left behind. Her eyes moved briefly to Mr. Calder. A past that had, in fact, returned. Mr. Calder did not speak, but something in his stillness shifted. Miss Marple continued. "The letter made that clear. It must be settled. Tonight." "Those are not the words of casual acquaintance." "No," Dr. Hayward murmured. "No," Miss Marple agreed. "They are the words of someone who seeks resolution." She paused. "Or retribution." The word hung in the air. Mrs. Fenwick gave a small involuntary sound. "And so," Miss Marple went on, "the visitor came. They spoke. And at some point the visitor ensured that Mrs. Harrowby would not survive the evening." Constable Briggs straightened. "You mean poison?" Miss Marple inclined her head. "Yes." A ripple of tension moved through the room. Miss Evesham's gaze dropped. Mr. Calder's jaw tightened. "The method," Miss Marple said calmly, "was simple. Something administered without suspicion. Something that would not cause immediate alarm." "The tea," Briggs said. "Yes." Miss Marple's eyes rested on him briefly. The tea." "But she didn't drink it," Mrs. Larkin said suddenly. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "No," she said, "she did not." The room fell silent. "That," Miss Marple continued, "is the crucial detail." She moved slowly toward the centre of the room. "The poison was not in the tea." A pause. Then where?" Briggs asked. Miss Marple turned. "In something taken earlier," she said. "Something habitual, something trusted." Her gaze moved, deliberately now, to one person. "Medicine." Dr. Hayward looked up sharply. Miss Marple's voice remained gentle. "Mrs. Harrowby was under your care, Doctor. You attended her regularly." Dr. Hayward's face had gone pale. "Yes, but—" "You would have known her habits," Miss Marple continued. "Her routines. What she took, and when." "I would never—" Miss Marple raised a hand, not unkindly. "I do not believe you would," she turned. "And yet the method remains." There was a long silence. Miss Marple's gaze shifted again. To administer such a thing, one would need access, trust, opportunity. Her eyes settled now, unmistakably on Miss Evesham. "And a reason." Miss Evesham did not move. "You visited her that evening," Miss Marple said. "Yes," Miss Evesham replied, her voice steady but thin. "You saw the letter." "Yes." "You knew it disturbed her." A pause. "Yes." Miss Marple took a step closer. "And you knew," she said softly, "that the past had found her." Miss Evesham's composure faltered. "Many people knew that," she said. "No," Miss Marple replied gently. "Not in the way you did." The room seemed to hold its breath. "You see," Miss Marple continued, "Mrs. Harrowby's past was not merely a mistake." She paused. "It was an injustice." Miss Evesham's hands tightened. "A long time ago," Miss Marple said, "a young girl's life was altered, not by accident, not by chance, but by the actions of someone who chose to protect herself at the expense of another." Miss Evesham's voice, when it came, was very quiet. "You don't know what you're saying." Miss Marple's gaze did not waver. "I believe," she said, "that I do." She spoke softly now. That girl grew up. She endured. She built a life. A pause. But she did not forget. Miss Evesham closed her eyes. And when she found Mrs. Harrowby again, Miss Marple continued, she sought not merely acknowledgement, but something more. Justice? Mr. Calder said quietly. Miss Marple shook her head slightly. No, she said, not justice. She looked at Miss Evesham. Balance. The silence broke. I didn't mean to, Miss Evesham began, then stopped. Miss Marple said nothing. It wasn't supposed to happen like that, Miss Evesham said, her voice trembling now. I only wanted her to admit it, to say what she'd done. And she would not, Miss Marple said gently. Miss Evesham shook her head. No, she said it was over, that it didn't matter any more. Miss Marple sighed softly. Yes, she said, that is often the way. I brought it with me, Miss Evesham said, almost in a whisper, in case she refused. The room was utterly still. I thought, just a little, just enough to make her understand. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. But she didn't understand, Miss Evesham said. She just sat there. And you stayed, Miss Marple said. Yes, until you were certain. Miss Evesham did not answer. And then, Miss Marple continued, you left. Not by the path, but through the rear, where the snow had not yet settled fully. A pause. And later, the snow covered what little trace remained. Constable Briggs stepped forward slowly. Miss Evesham did not resist. I didn't want to kill her, she said quietly. Miss Marple looked at her with a mixture of sadness and understanding. No, she said. But you did. The fire crackled softly. And in that quiet room, the truth, so long concealed beneath silence, habit, and snow, finally stood revealed. The quiet. After. There is, Miss Marple often thought, a particular kind of silence that follows truth. It is not the same as the silence that precedes it. Before there is tension, uncertainty, the subtle weight of things unspoken. But after, there is a stillness of a different kind. Not peaceful. Exactly. Not entirely, but settled, as though something that had long been suspended has finally come to rest. Bramblewick, in the days that followed, knew that silence well. Miss Evesham was gone, taken quietly without spectacle, under the careful watch of Constable Briggs, and with Dr. Hayward's solemn presence lending the moment a quiet gravity. There had been no resistance, no further denial, only a subdued acceptance that seemed, in its way, more unsettling than protest would have been. The village, which had so recently buzzed with speculation, now spoke in softer tones. People greeted one another with the same politeness as before, yet something had shifted behind their eyes. A shared awareness, perhaps, that beneath even the most ordinary lives there could lie stories no one had truly seen. Mrs. Fenwick, for her part, found the adjustment difficult. I cannot reconcile it, she said one afternoon as she poured tea with trembling hands. Miss Evesham, so composed, so proper, and yet— Miss Marple, seated by the window with her knitting, did not look up immediately. Yes, she said gently, and yet— Mrs. Fenwick sighed. It seems impossible. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. Not impossible, she said. Merely human. Outside, the snow had begun to melt. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in small, steady ways. The sharp edges softened. The paths reappeared. Footprints, old and new, blurred together until they lost their meaning entirely. Miss Marple watched it with quiet interest. Snow is a curious thing, she said after a moment. It preserves and it conceals, but it does not last. Mrs. Fenwick followed her gaze. No, she said softly. It does not. There had been, in the end, no great satisfaction in the solution, only understanding. Miss Marple had seen it before, many times. The moment when truth, once uncovered, did not bring triumph, but a kind of quiet sorrow. Miss Evesham had not been a monster, nor had Mrs. Harrowby been entirely innocent. The past, as it so often did, had refused to remain buried, and when it resurfaced, it had done so not with violence, but with inevitability. Miss Marple set aside her knitting. There is a tendency, she said, to think of wrongdoing in simple terms, good people, bad people, right and wrong. Mrs. Fenwick nodded uncertainly. Yes, I suppose so. But life is rarely so clear, Miss Marple continued. People make choices, sometimes small ones, sometimes larger ones, and those choices, they linger. She paused. They do not disappear simply because we wish them to. Mrs. Fenwick shivered slightly. You mean Mrs. Harrowby's past? Yes. And Miss Eversham's? Miss Marple inclined her head. Both. There was a silence. And Mr. Calder? Mrs. Fenwick asked hesitantly. He seemed so affected. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Mr. Calder is a man who understands regret, she said. In what way? He too suspected something of Mrs. Harrowby's past. Not the details, perhaps, but enough to recognise its weight. And yet he said nothing. No? Why not? Miss Marple looked toward the window again. Because, she said quietly, some people believe that silence is kinder than truth. Mrs. Fenwick considered this. Is it? Miss Marple's smile was gentle but tinged with something deeper. Not always. The cottage at the edge of the village stood empty now, its windows dark, its gate closed once more. No one had yet decided what should be done with it. Such decisions in places like Bramblewick were never made quickly. Miss Marple had walked past it that morning. She had paused just briefly at the gate. The path, once marked so clearly in snow, was now bare. Whatever had happened there had left no visible trace. And yet, Miss Marple knew better than to trust appearances. That afternoon she prepared to leave. Her visit, originally intended as a quiet retreat, had become something rather different. But then, that too was not unusual. Mrs. Fenwick insisted on accompanying her to the door. You must come again, she said, though perhaps under less troubling circumstances. Miss Marple smiled. My dear Mrs. Fenwick, she replied. Trouble has a way of finding us wherever we go. Mrs. Fenwick gave a faint, uneasy laugh. Yes, I suppose it does. At the gate, Miss Marple paused. The air was softer now, the sharpness of winter beginning to ease. I shall write, she said. Please do. And you must not dwell too much on what has happened. Mrs. Fenwick hesitated. I shall try. Miss Marple nodded. That is all one can do. As she made her way down the lane, her steps slow but steady, Miss Marple allowed her thoughts to settle. The case, if one could call it that, had not been complex in its mechanics. No elaborate deception, no intricate scheme, only people, their choices, their memories, and the quiet, persistent influence of the past. She paused once more, turning slightly to look back at the village. Bramblewick appeared much as it had when she arrived. Calm, orderly, unchanged. And yet, she knew that was not entirely true. Something had shifted, not outwardly perhaps, but beneath, in the subtle way people regarded one another, in the awareness that even the most familiar faces might carry hidden histories. Miss Marple adjusted her gloves. Yes, she said softly to herself, that is how it always is. The carriage awaited at the far end of the lane. She moved toward it with quiet purpose. Behind her the village continued as it always had. Ahead the world, equally unchanged, equally full of its own small mysteries. And somewhere, in another quiet place, in another seemingly ordinary life, Miss Marple knew. There would be another story waiting, not yet told, not yet understood, but already there, hidden, as such things always were, in the smallest of details. In the end, the death at the Winter Cottage was not merely a question of how or when, it was a question of why, and as Miss Marple had so often observed, the answer to that question was never found in the obvious. It lay instead in the quiet spaces between people, in memory, in regret, in the things left unsaid. Mrs. Harrowby had believed her past was finished. Miss Eversham had believed it could be corrected. Both, in their own way, had been mistaken. For the past does not end. It waits, and in time it returns, not always with force but with certainty, like snow falling silently in the night, covering everything, until, at last, something beneath it begins to show.